The silence in the grand dining room was so heavy I could feel it pressing against my chest. My father, or the man I had called father for 24 years, sat at the head of the table, his face twisted in a sneer that had become the soundtrack of my life. He held a crumpled DNA report in his hand, the paper trembling slightly. Behind him, my golden child brother, Julian, was smirking, already eyeing the keys to the vintage Porsche that sat in the driveway, the car that was supposed to be my graduation gift, but was now being reallocated. "You were a mistake from the moment you were born, Leo," my father hissed, his voice cold enough to freeze the wine in the glasses. "A biological glitch, a stain on this family's name. And now I finally have the proof that you don't even belong at this table. You're a nobody, a stranger's accident." He tossed the paper toward me. It landed in my salad, the ink smearing against the balsamic dressing. My mother looked away, staring at the expensive oil painting on the far wall as if it were more important than her youngest son being publicly disowned. But they didn't know one thing. They thought this test was their ultimate weapon to strip me of my dignity and my inheritance. They had no idea that I had already visited a different lab 3 days ago. They thought they were holding the truth, but they were actually holding a death warrant for their own web of lies. Right now, I am standing in the foyer of a house that feels more like a museum than a home. My bags are packed, 2 small suitcases containing everything I've been allowed to keep. The conflict isn't just about money or a fancy car. It's about a lifetime of being told I was less than. In my family, the Thorne name is synonymous with perfection, wealth, and status. Julian is the perfect Thorne. He's a lawyer, he's athletic, and he looks exactly like my father, George. Then there's me. I have dark curly hair and green eyes, features that nobody else in the family possesses. For years, George used this physical difference as a psychological whip. Every mistake I made, every time I didn't live up to his impossible standards, he would remind me that I was the mistake child. He claimed I was the result of a weak moment and that I should be grateful just to have a roof over my head. The tension reached a breaking point when my grandfather, the real architect of the Thorne fortune, passed away 6 months ago. His will was specific. The bulk of the estate would be divided between his grandchildren. But George didn't want me to have a cent. He spent the last month orchestrating this grand reveal, certain that a DNA test would legally erase me from the will and give Julian everything. The injustice of it burns. I've worked twice as hard as Julian just to get a fraction of the praise. I've stayed silent while they mocked my interests in music and art, calling them hobbies for failures. But today, the silence ends. The betrayal isn't just that they don't want me, it's that they've built a cage of lies to keep me small. They think they are throwing me out onto the street with nothing. They don't realize that the truth I found is going to take this entire house down with me. I remember the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, cinnamon and old cedar. That was the only place I ever felt safe. When I was 7, I asked her why my hair was curly when Julian's was straight. She went very quiet, her hands trembling as she kneaded dough. "You have the heart of an artist, Leo," she whispered, never looking me in the eye. "Sometimes the most beautiful things in a garden are the ones that look the least like the others." Growing up in the Thorne household was like living in a constant state of auditioning for a role I was destined to lose. Dinner times were the worst. George would spend 40 minutes grilling Julian on his mock trial results or his rowing times. Then he would turn to me, his eyes narrowing. "And what did you do today, Leo?" I remember the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, cinnamon and old cedar. That was the only place I ever felt safe. When I was 7, I asked her why my hair was curly when Julian's was straight. She went very quiet, her hands trembling as she kneaded dough. "You have the heart of an artist, Leo," she whispered, never looking me in the eye. "Sometimes the most beautiful things in a garden are the ones that look the least like the others." Growing up in the Thorne household was like living in a constant state of auditioning for a role I was destined to lose. Dinner times were the worst. George would spend 40 minutes grilling Julian on his mock trial results or his rowing times. Then he would turn to me, his eyes narrowing. "And what did you do today, Leo? Painted another picture? Spent more time wasting my tuition money on creativity?" I remember a specific afternoon when I was 12. I had won a regional art competition. I came home glowing, holding the blue ribbon tightly. I found George in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the smell of expensive tobacco. I showed him the ribbon. He didn't even take it from my hand. "A ribbon for painting," he chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Julian just made captain of the junior varsity team. That's a real achievement. Put that ribbon away, Leo. It's embarrassing. You're lucky I even let you stay in this house, given how much of a disappointment you are." I went to my room and cried until my throat was raw. I started to believe him. I started to think that maybe I was a mistake. I looked at the family photos on the mantel, the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the square jaws, and I saw a stranger staring back at me in the mirror. My mother, Catherine, was always a ghost in these moments. She would bring me cookies afterward, but she would never stand up to him. "Just try to be more like your brother, honey," she would say. "It makes things easier for everyone." The environment was one of polished surfaces and hidden bruises. We had the best of everything, the best clothes, the best cars, the best vacations. But I felt like I was living in a beautiful cage where the bars were made of my father's expectations. I learned to be quiet. I learned to hide my ribbons and my dreams. I learned that in the Thorne family, love was a currency that was only paid to the people who looked and acted like the man at the head of the table. The red flags weren't just in the insults, they were in the subtle shifts of reality. When I turned 18, I expected to get my trust fund, just like Julian did. But when the day came, George sat me down in that same cold study. "There's been a change, Leo," he said, tapping a pen against the desk. "The market has been volatile. We've had to consolidate the funds. Julian's portion was secured earlier, but yours, well, we need to keep it in a holding account for now. You're not quite responsible enough yet." I knew Julian had already spent 10,000 of his fund on a spring break trip to Ibiza. I was working a part-time job at a library to pay for my art supplies. The imbalance was staggering, but I didn't say anything. I was still trying to earn his love. Then there were the conversations I wasn't meant to hear. One night I was coming down for a glass of water when I heard my parents arguing in the kitchen. "You can't keep treating him this way, George." Her voice was hushed, frantic. "The neighbors are starting to notice. He's 20 years old." "I don't care what the neighbors think, Catherine," George snapped. "Look at him. He looks nothing like me. He acts nothing like me. Every time I look at him, I'm reminded of the doubt. If he's not mine, why should I spend another cent on his future? He's a mistake I've been paying for 20 decades. "He is your son, George. Legally, he is yours," she pleaded. "Legally isn't biological," he growled. That was the first time I heard the word biological used as a weapon. It wasn't just about my hair or my eyes anymore. He was questioning my very existence. After that, the neglect turned into active hostility. Julian started picking up on it too. He would leave his dirty laundry in my room, telling me I should get used to serving the real Thornes. When I graduated from college, with honors, though nobody from my family attended the ceremony, I was promised a car. Instead, I was given a bus pass and told that my room was being turned into Julian's new home office. I was moved to the small guest cottage at the back of the property, a place that smelled of damp earth and neglect. The favoritism was no longer a secret, it was the new family policy. George was waiting for something. He was waiting for a reason to cut the final cord. And when my grandfather died and left that specific clause in the will, George finally found his excuse. The month after the funeral was a whirlwind of lawyers and tension. My grandfather, Arthur Thorne, had always been kind to me in a distant, formal way. His will stated that the grandchildren would inherit his coastal estate and a significant portion of his investment portfolio, but only upon verification of lineage. George seized on those 3 words like a starving man. Verification of lineage, he repeated at the breakfast table, a wicked glint in his eyes. That means DNA tests for everyone. We have to be sure the Thorne blood is pure before the money is released. Wouldn't want a mistake getting his hands on Arthur's hard-earned legacy, would we? Julian laughed, spilling orange juice. Better start looking for a new apartment, Leo. I hear the homeless shelters are quite creative these days. I felt a cold dread. Not because I was afraid of the test, but because of the look on my mother's face. She looked terrified. She wouldn't meet my eyes for a week. George started bringing home brochures for luxury condos, talking about how he and Julian were going to remodel the coastal estate. He spoke as if I were already gone. 2 weeks ago, the official kits arrived. George insisted we all do it together in the living room, overseen by a private notary he had hired. It felt like a public execution. As I rubbed the swab against my cheek, George watched me with a look of pure triumph. "The truth always comes out, Leo," he whispered. The stakes were now astronomical. If the test came back negative, I would lose everything, my home, my inheritance, and the only family I had ever known, however flawed they were. But more than that, I would be branded a fraud. Then the antagonist's actions became truly desperate. I caught George in my guest cottage one afternoon, rifling through my drawers. "What are you doing?" I asked, my heart hammering. "Just looking for any evidence you might be hiding," he sneered. "I found your birth certificate, Leo. Interesting how the doctor who signed it was a close friend of your mother's family. Very convenient." He was trying to build a case of fraud against my mother to invalidate my birth. He was willing to destroy his own wife's reputation just to make sure I got nothing. The escalation didn't stop there. He contacted the library where I worked and told them I was under investigation for theft, getting me suspended without pay. He was cutting off my oxygen one straw at a time. He wanted me so broken that I wouldn't have the strength to fight back when the results arrived. The week before the results were due, I couldn't sleep. The walls of the guest cottage felt like they were closing in. I needed to know the truth for myself, away from George's hired notary and his hand-picked lab. I took a bus to a neighboring city and went to an independent clinic. I paid extra for a rush paternity and ancestry test. I used a sample of my own hair and a stray hair I had found on George's old hairbrush years ago. I had kept it in a small box, a weird memento of a father I wanted to know. 3 days later, the digital notification popped up on my phone. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I opened the file. The result for George was what I expected, 0% probability of paternity. George was not my father. A wave of nausea hit me. He was right. All those years, he was right. I was a mistake. But then I scrolled down to the Ancestry and DNA Matches section. Because I had opted in to the Relative Finder database, the system had flagged a high percentage match nearby. Match, Thomas Miller. Relationship, Biological father, 99.9%. I didn't know a Thomas Miller. I searched the name on my laptop. My breath hitched. Thomas Miller was a renowned architect who had passed away 5 years ago, but the shock wasn't the name, it was the photo in his obituary. He had dark, curly hair, he had green eyes, he looked exactly like me. But there was a link I hadn't expected. I found an old news article about Thomas Miller. He had been the lead architect on the Thorne Plaza, George's father's biggest project. And in the background of a photo at the groundbreaking ceremony, there was my mother, Catherine, looking younger and happier than I had ever seen her. I realized the truth in a flash of clarity. My mother didn't have an accident, she had a life, and George knew. He had always known. But as I kept digging into Thomas Miller's estate, I found a legal document filed in a different county. Thomas hadn't forgotten about me. He had left a sealed trust for the son of Catherine Thorne to be opened only if a DNA test ever proved his paternity. I reached out to the lawyer listed on the document, a man named Silas Vane. Within an hour, Silas called me back. "Leo," Silas said, his voice grave and wise, "your father, Thomas, loved your mother very much, but George found out. He threatened to ruin Thomas and put your mother on the street if they ever spoke again. George forced her to stay, and George forced Thomas to stay away. But Thomas left you something that George can never touch. And he left me the evidence of how George stole your grandfather's inheritance from both of you." Suspense built in my throat. George hadn't just been mean, he had been a criminal. He had altered my grandfather's original trust years ago to funnel money away from my mother and towards himself. The truth wasn't just about my blood, it was about a 20-year heist. Silas Vane told me we had 48 hours before George's official results would be presented. "We need to move fast, Leo," Silas warned. "If George signs those papers to disinherit you based on his lab's results, it will take years to undo. We need to strike during the reveal." Those 48 hours were a blur of internal struggle. I walked around the Thorne estate like a ghost. I watched Julian and George drinking whiskey on the patio, celebrating a victory they hadn't even officially won yet. I looked at my mother, who seemed to be shrinking into the upholstery of the chairs. Part of me wanted to run, to take my suitcases and disappear into the life Thomas Miller had left for me. I didn't need the Thorne name. I didn't need George's approval. But then I thought about the 12-year-old boy with the blue ribbon. I thought about the library job I lost. I thought about the way they treated my mother. I wasn't doing this for the money. I was doing this for justice. Silas and I met in secret at a diner. He handed me a leather portfolio. In here is the original, unaltered will of Arthur Thorne, and the proof that George has been embezzling from your mother's personal accounts for a decade. The time pressure is on us, Leo. Once he announces those results at the family gathering tomorrow night, the notary will file the disinheritance. You have to stop him before he signs. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the guest cottage, listening to the owls. I felt a strange mix of fear and power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the mistake. I was the person with the map. I practiced what I would say. I imagined the look on George's face. I worried that my mother would hate me for exposing her secret, but Silas's words echoed in my head. The truth doesn't break families, Leo. Lies do. The morning of the reveal, the air felt electric. George had invited a few close family associates and the notary for a formal dinner. He wanted an audience for my humiliation. I dressed in my best suit, the one I had bought with my own library money. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a Thorne. I saw a Miller, and for the first time, I liked what I saw. The countdown was in my head. 10 hours, 5 hours, 1 hour. I tucked the portfolio under my arm and walked toward the main house. The dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. George sat at the head, Julian to his right. My mother sat at the far end, her eyes red-rimmed. 3 business associates sat looking uncomfortable, sensing the blood in the water. "Before we have dessert," George said, standing up and clinking his glass with a silver spoon, "we have a bit of official business to conclude. As many of you know, the Thorne estate requires a clear line of succession. We received the DNA results this afternoon." He looked at me, a predatory smile on his face. "The results are conclusive," George announced, handing a sheet to the notary. "Leo is not a biological Thorne. Therefore, under the terms of Arthur Thorne's will and the amendments I have filed, he is hereby stripped of all claims to the family name and assets. He has until midnight to vacate the property." Julian started to clap. The associates looked at their plates. "Is that all, George?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady. "Isn't it enough, mistake?" George sneered. "Now get out before I have security throw you out." "I have a result of my own," I said, standing up. I opened my portfolio and pulled out the independent report. "You're right, George, I'm not your son, and thank God for that, because I'm the son of Thomas Miller." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. George's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. "How dare you bring that name into this house?" George roared. "I brought more than a name," I said, sliding the original will of Arthur Thorne across the table toward the notary. "I brought the unaltered will, the one that says the estate goes to the grandchildren and their mothers, and that any attempt by the executor to manipulate the lineage results in an immediate forfeiture of their own share." The notary froze, looking at the seal on the document. This is an original filing. Mr. Thorne, where did you get this?" "George," I said, leaning over the table, "you didn't just lie about my birth. You lied to your own father. You've been stealing from my mother's trust for 20 years to pay for Julian's lifestyle and your own failing investments. I have the bank statements, the forged signatures, and the confession Silas Vane has from your former accountant." "You're lying," Julian shouted. "Dad, tell him he's lying." But George couldn't speak. He was looking at my mother, and for the first time in 24 years, she wasn't looking away. She stood up, her chair screeching against the hardwood. "It's over, George," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I knew you were cruel. I didn't know you were a thief. Leo is the only good thing that ever happened in this house, and you tried to kill his spirit every day. No more." The emotional explosion was palpable. The associates were already whispering, reaching for their phones. George's grand reveal had turned into his public execution. George tried to grab the documents from the notary, but the man pulled them back. "Mr. Thorne," the notary said, his voice now stern, "if these documents are authentic, and they appear to be, you are no longer the executor of this estate. In fact, under the bad faith clause of Arthur Thorne's original will, your entire share is now under legal review. Leo and his mother are the primary beneficiaries." The look on George's face was the most satisfying thing I have ever seen. It wasn't just anger, it was the realization that he had played his last card and lost the whole game. "I built this," George screamed. "I kept this family together." "No," I said, "you kept a secret together, and secrets have a way of coming out." I pulled out the final document, the trust from Thomas Miller. "And as for the mistake child," I said, "my real father left me enough to buy this entire estate twice over. But I don't want it. I don't want the Thorne name. I don't want your blood-stained money." "Then give it to me," Julian yelled, desperation in his eyes. "No, Julian," I said, looking at my brother. "Now you get to see what being a real Thorne is worth when the money is gone. George, the police are on their way. Embezzlement and fraud are serious charges, and since you disowned me publicly tonight, I have no reason to protect you." The reversal was complete. The power had shifted from the head of the table to the mistake at the end of it. George's plan to use the DNA test as a weapon had backfired perfectly. It was the test that gave me the legal standing to challenge his executorship. If he had just left me alone, he could have kept stealing for another decade. His own cruelty was his undoing. I looked at my mother. "Are you coming with me?" She looked at George, then at Julian, who was already trying to hide his expensive watch. Then she looked at me and nodded. "I should have left 20 years ago," she said. We walked out of the dining room, leaving George and Julian in the ruins of their own making. As we reached the door, I heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. The Thorne perfection was over. The legal fallout was massive. George was arrested that night. The forensic audit Silas Vane conducted revealed that George had funneled over $5 million out of the family trust over the years. He was charged with grand larceny, fraud, and embezzlement. Because of the bad faith clause in my grandfather's will, George lost his claim to the coastal estate. Julian, who had never worked a day in his life, found himself homeless and penniless within months. He tried to sue me, but Silas shut that down before it even reached a courtroom. Julian is currently working as a junior clerk at a firm that used to mock him. It's a humbling fall for the golden child. My mother filed for divorce the week after the confrontation. She moved into a beautiful apartment in the city, paid for by the trust Thomas Miller had left for her. She's finally taking art classes of her own, rediscovering the person she was before George Thorne tried to erase her. As for the Thorne estate, I sold it. I didn't want to live in a museum of bad memories. I used the proceeds to start a foundation for young artists from broken or neglected homes, the Miller Foundation. George was sentenced to 8 years in prison. I visited him once. He sat behind the glass, looking older and smaller than I ever remembered. "You should have known," George muttered, not even looking at me. "You always had your father's eyes." "You did know, George," I said. "That's why you hated me. But you didn't hate me because I was a mistake. You hated me because I was the truth you couldn't hide." I never went back. The social fallout was just as severe. The Thorne name, once a symbol of prestige, became a point line in the local business circles. The perfection was revealed to be a hollow shell. People who had once ignored me at parties now tried to climb over each other to get an invite to the Miller Foundation galas. I ignored them all. I had learned early on that the only people worth keeping are the ones who are there when the lights are off. Tonight, I am sitting in my own studio. It's not a grand mansion, it's a loft with big windows and the smell of oil paints and turpentine. It's the best smell in the world. The rain is drumming against the glass, but it's not a cold sound anymore. It's peaceful. I look at the painting on my easel. It's a portrait of my grandmother in her kitchen. I finally finished it. I've realized that being a mistake was the best thing that ever happened to me. If George had loved me, I might have become just like Julian, entitled, hollow, and cruel. Because I was rejected, I had to build my own foundation. I had to find my own truth. I'm no longer Leo Thorne. I am Leo Miller. And for the first time in my life, that name feels like it fits. I see my mother often. We don't talk about George much. Instead, we talk about the future. We talk about the gallery show I have coming up. We talk about the kids at the foundation. We've both grown so much in the last year. She's not a ghost anymore. She's a woman with a voice. Personal growth isn't about forgetting the past. It's about taking the broken pieces and making something new out of them. I'm not cured of the trauma George caused, but I'm no longer defined by it. I am not a biological glitch. I am a deliberate, creative, and strong man. The ending isn't a grand party or a revenge montage. It's just me in my studio, picking up a brush. I'm not auditioning for a role anymore. I'm just living my life, and that is the greatest justice of all. I think about Thomas Miller sometimes. I wonder what he would think of me. Silas says he would be proud. I like to think that every time I paint, I'm talking to him. I'm showing him that his love, even from afar, was enough to save me from the Thorne coldness. I am Leo Miller, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Family isn't always about whose blood is in your veins. It's about who stands by you when the world gets cold. My story started with a lie that was meant to destroy me, but it ended with a truth that set me free. I want to ask you, have you ever been told you weren't good enough or that you were a mistake by the people who were supposed to love you? How did you find your own strength to prove them wrong? We all have a George in our lives, someone who tries to tell us who we are, but the only person who gets to decide your value is you. Please share your stories of overcoming family drama or finding your own identity in the comments below. Your story might be the hope someone else needs today. If you found strength in Leo's journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We share these deep, personal stories of justice and resilience every single week to remind you that you are never alone. Thank you for listening. Remember, you are never a mistake. You are a masterpiece in progress. See you in the next story.